So, welcome back to the Formed Book Club with Vivian Dudrow, Joseph Pearce, and myself, Father Fessio. I had a friend in high school, Bill Klein, who sat next to me. He was reading Everlasting Man by J.K. Chesterton, but he called it the Everlasting Book because he kept reading and reading and never quite got finished. We're having a little bit of the same situation here with Cardinal Sarah, the Everlasting Book, but it's hard to go any faster on this particular book because of what he says about so many current, topical, important issues. And even if we might disagree on some points, and we're going to probably bring some up today, he's speaking prophetically on many others, and definitely this should be something which is the subject of conversation by people. So I believe we finished part
Father,
2. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah.
If Chesterton is everlasting is the everlasting book, perhaps we should call this book "The Day Is Now Fast Spent But Never Ends."
Yeah. Endless day. So last week, my last comment, I believe, was on chapter 6, Hatred of Life, which is in part 2, Man Belittled. And I know that I don't have anything left until part 3, anything more until part 3, but I might have left you two out. Do you have anything prior to page 205?
Well, I thought that we were going to reconvene in chapter 6.
Okay.
And I was going to just make some comment on the opening page of that chapter.
All right. Okay. Well, I could have misunderstood.
That was my understanding anyway. One of us has obviously got things confused. I'll assume it's me, but nonetheless, the legalization of abortion is the matrix of all sorts of transgressions. This is page 183, Father.
Okay.
Right at the beginning of chapter 6, the hatred of life.
Okay.
Just a few lines down into it.
All
the
right.
legalization of abortion is the matrix for all sorts of transgressions. Who has the right to live? Who is condemned to death? Does a child with trisomy 21 inevitably belong to the second category of human beings? Mother Teresa thought that a society in which a woman has the right to kill her baby is intrinsically barbaric. And then a few lines further down, a murder becomes good, justified, legitimate. A crime becomes a right. The Catholic Church is radically opposed to this mass murder, this crime against humanity. Now, one thing I just wanted to basically highlight those lines from that page is the way that Cardinal Sarah does not mince his words. He does not euphemize. He basically tells it how it is. And, basically, the killing of children, you don't use euphemisms like procreative rights for the killing of children. And one thing I like about Cardinal Sarah is the way that throughout all of this book, he's got actually just a fresh way of telling it how it is. And that's, I think, one of the strengths of this book.
Well, going back to Chesterton, that was one of his great gifts, was to see old things through new eyes, see them as if you were seeing them for the first time. And while Cardinal Sarah is aware, very aware of what's happening in the West, he's coming from a tradition and a culture where they were more close to the earth, they were more natural. The things which now seem to us not so unnatural, to him seem horribly unnatural, because he's coming from an environment where they haven't been, haven't had their minds sanitized. One other thing, I see now, my error here, we had finished chapter 5 last week.
Right.
Which is the first part of chapter 2, first part of part 2, first chapter, part 2. And I didn't actually have anything I wanted to say I didn't know anything on chapter 6. I must have been tired or something. That's why I jumped into part 3. But no, you're right. We want to cover part 2, chapter 6 on the hatred of life.
Yes, and Cardinal Sarah would certainly agree with Mother Teresa, because he quotes her extensively on page 185, where she says, to me, the nations who have legalized abortion, they are the poorest nations. And the attitude of the modern industrial nations. And by the way, as we're talking about modern industrial nations, I would like to include China on the list of nations. His focus is almost exclusively on the West, and we being Westerners, we need to have the maturity to hear the critique. But by the same token, we need to include China on this list of barbaric, modern, industrialized countries where we know with that one-child policy, all the forced abortions, all of the, I mean, talk about a massacre of children.
And the overt persecution of Christians. I mean, Cardinal Sarah is perfectly correct that the modern West, Europe, and the United States is a monstrosity, but China is a bigger monstrosity. Whatever is bad in the West is worse there.
Right.
And it's important to say this because a very high-placed Vatican official recently, I won't mention his name, but very high-placed, described China as the country whose policies were closest to the Catholic social teaching.
Wow.
How is that possible?
Wow.
You know?
It's impossible.
I mean...
But going back to this point about the nations legalizing abortion being the poorest nations that Mother Teresa points out and that Cardinal Sarah also echoes many times throughout the book. And the irony is that this policy is pursued with the assumption that it's children who make a country poor. It's children
Right.
who weigh down a society and weigh down women and all these things. But it's really the opposite is the case, that children are a country's future and a country's wealth. And sometimes people, as you say, Father, who have this more earthy background can see that more clearly than sophisticated, industrialized nations.
And to transcend that as well, though, I'm agreeing with everything you're saying, Vivian, but it's ultimately something that transcends economics anyway. The way that most of us learn to grow up is by having children. In other words, this teaches us that responsibilities are more important than rights, and that we don't even talk about rights until we've actually done our responsibility. And children teach us that par excellence, in fact, better than anything else. And so when a country loses its love for children, it loses its ability to be responsible, and then you have the anarchy, which is the consequence.
Yes.
And as one who has not had any natural children, and therefore has not entirely grown up, I would admit, nevertheless, I was thinking about the Jewish people sometime, recently on this topic, that for the Jews, I mean, having children, being fruitful was so important. Partly because they realized they didn't believe in the afterlife, most of them. And so what is your legacy? What's life for if you're not going to produce someone who's going to carry on your family name and your traditions and what you've achieved and so on? And there is a deep truth in that, even though we as Christians believe that there's a life after this. Nevertheless, from the point of view of human life, what is there after all is said and done except your children?
Right.
I mean, your stock portfolio, the building you built, I mean, the great political decisions you made, the battles you won, it's all gone.
Right.
What's left is your children. And especially in the Christian dispensation, we know that they have immortal souls. We're building up a kingdom that's going to last forever.
Yeah.
That's where our society seems to me is so upside down in the way it looks at things, It's like looking at the world through a telescope the wrong way. Anyway, that's the end of my homily on that. Let's go forward here.
Well, I have something on 187, and I will try to actually move this on a bit because I know that Father doesn't have anything for another 20 or so pages. But I did want to highlight this middle of page 187. And I've just come back from Hungary, and one of the biggest enemies of Hungary is George Soros. The American billionaire who's using his money and power to propagate the culture of death. And he has actually declared war specifically on Hungary and its efforts to restore a Christian civilization in that corner of Central Europe. So I just wanted to highlight these two sentences from middle of page.
Back up just a moment, Joseph.
Yeah.
He's from Hungary, George Soros. You said an American billionaire. He's from Hungary.
Well, that would explain why he's so hell-bent, literally, on undermining Hungary's future.
Yes.
But when I was there, his name came up over and over again for obvious reasons.
I believe it.
So I just want to read these two sentences from the middle of page 187. Large foundations in the hands of Western billionaires develop programs for exterminating preborn children.
Yeah.
This struggle to spread death at all costs is a monstrosity and an unbridled use of economic power to destroy the weak and the defenseless. That really is very applicable to a certain Mr. Soros.
Yes. And he's a utopian ideologue. You know, he's promoting an idea of a nationless world, a borderless world, a control from the utmost heights.
Which will mean, of course, a global plutocracy run by people like George Soros. Right?
Yes, that's right.
He did nothing productive to earn his money. His hands are callous free. He bet against the English government and shorted England on the pound and won a bet. He's a very, very lucky gambler who, I will admit, used God's given intelligence to make a prediction that made him billions of dollars. But what good did that do? I mean, it's not like somebody, at least let's say with Bill Gates, you know, he worked on an operating system, MS-DOS in those days, you know, that was a useful thing for millions of people. So, okay, I mean, he spends his money too with the Gates Foundation, some of the same way that
Right.
Soros does, although not as embitteredly hostile to conservative values, although just bad enough in Asia and Africa. Nevertheless, I don't criticize him for being wealthy. He's produced something which people demand. It's a good thing. But Soros he's using badly acquired funds to do evil. That's really, I have no excuse for it.
Well, and the language that the cardinal uses to describe him and others like him on top of page 191, he says, "These people dance on the cadavers of hundreds of thousands of fragile human beings whom they have deliberately sacrificed in order to keep their dominance. The church is the last rampart against this macabre, suicidal, New World ethic. She must enlighten the consciences of everyone." You know, well, that's a tall order for the church. I don't know how well we're living up to it, but we're doing our little bit right here, right?
That's it. I mean, if we do this,
well, the point of the church's magisterium is completely in tune with what Cardinal Sarah is saying here. The fact that there are members of the church that seem oblivious to what the church has always taught is the curse of modernism, which in some ways is always with us. But the point is, we need to know that he's completely correct when he's talking about the church as the mystical body of Jesus Christ, not the church as a group of largely dysfunctional human beings.
Right, right. And speaking of, you know, masses of cadavers, the cardinal also talks about the Holocaust and what is really the sort of spiritual reality behind the intention of eliminating the Jews, but to kill God himself. If you can eliminate a people with a history in which God intervened, you can eliminate that people, eliminate that history, you eliminate God from human memory. And as we know, the church is in the sights of the same people who go after the Jews also go after the church, because the church is the continuation of this intervention, which is we're about to celebrate on Christmas, right? The incarnation, the coming of God into human history. The enemies who line up against destroying the Jewish race also usually want to destroy the church.
Yeah, the interesting thing was, again, I was involved in Budapest last week as a part of a discussion group, and one of the other people on the panel was someone very high up in the European Union, clearly a secularist and a pragmatist and a relativist, and he accused me at one point of, I suppose you support a theocracy and a return to the Inquisition. And I said, that the Inquisition was nothing compared with secularism and relativism, with the French Revolution, with the Nazis, with the communists, and the hundreds of millions of people killed in the last 200 years by that secularist creed. Please don't speak to me about the Inquisition. I think you better look in the mirror, But that's the whole point, is that we still hear the same old rubbish being churned out against the church. In actual fact, by comparison, our hands are bloodless.
Well, let's not go that far, but
So by comparison, you take
by comparison.
2,000 or 3,000 people, maybe at the most, in the whole Inquisitional history that were put to death, compared to hundreds of millions. It's not.
Right.
It's bad. It shouldn't have happened. But there's another thing there that also I'm not justifying the excesses of the Inquisition, but what was the point? The point was that they believed that spiritual sickness was worse than material sickness, and therefore, if people were introducing the venom of falsehood into society, of rejection of God, rejection of the moral values the church taught, that was harming society worse than a plague.
Right.
And therefore, they wanted to eliminate this. That was wrong to do that.
Yeah. Well, but bad ideas have bad consequences. Look at how someone like Karl Marx or Friedrich Nietzsche comes along and ends up with being communist revolutions and Nazi bloodbaths. Marx and Nietzsche between them have killed far more people than any mass murderer, any serial killer. Bad ideas have disastrous consequences, and that basically was the idea behind the Inquisition, to try to put an end to such bad ideas and their disastrous consequences.
Well, and really the worst excesses of the Inquisition were the result of the Inquisition being used by the temporal power.
Yeah.
And I mean the church courts were actually, by comparison of the civil courts, were actually more just. Did not accept confessions under torture and all the rest of it. They had a very high standard, much higher than the paradigm of the time. But when that got in the hands of a crown who wanted to get rid of enemies and take their stuff, that's when the worst excesses of the Inquisition happened.
All right.
Well, where do we go now?
Well, I'm now happy to move on to chapter 7, so I don't know.
Well, if I may, I'd like to do one more little thing.
Absolutely.
Because he ends this chapter of all of this death, death and murder and mass murder. And he mentions even the Armenian genocide. I'm on every page. He's talking about this. But what's so interesting, he ends the chapter on the point of beauty, the importance of beauty. He says that modern man has a talent for making everything he touches ugly. And what could be uglier than these mass murders and genocides, right? And so he's talking about, he tells this very poignant story. You're going to have to get the book yourselves and read this very poignant story about the boy going to a concentration camp with his mother.
Page 201 here.
And looking up at his mother's face and realizing that beauty is needed even more in the horrible place that they're going. But just the fact that beauty as a transcendental along with truth and goodness, these rise together and they fall together. And the fact that he would end on that point, I think, is very important for our time.
And he'll say some more things about art, I think, later on.
Later on.
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Gesundheit.
Yes. So that ends part 2, Man Be Little. Part 1 was the spiritual and religious collapse. So now we move into part 3, the fall of truth, moral decadence, and bad political habits. Let's jump right into that then. Anybody have something before page 207?
Well, I've got 205. I can try.
Oh, let's go.
Okay. Just right at the beginning of the chapter, I just love the imagery he uses here. It's absolutely correct. Modern man in the West disdains the past. And then at the beginning of the next paragraph, modern man has amnesia. And then the beginning of the following paragraph, now by living in a perpetual change, modern man deprives himself of a compass. Young people can condemn the errors of previous generations. And then at the end of that paragraph, however, even the darkest pages of history must not be forgotten. And returning to the subject we just talked about, it is of capital importance to maintain the memory of the Holocaust. Fundamentally, tradition is an agreement with the future that we find in the past. I mean, again, that last statement particularly very Chestertonian. Chesterton, of course, famously said that tradition is the proxy of the dead and the enfranchisement of the unborn. And this modern amnesia, where we know nothing about the past because new generations are being kept deliberately ignorant of it, means, of course, you have a rise of Marxism amongst the young because they are completely ignorant of where that's led in the past. That it's a truism, but if we won't have a memory, if we don't learn the lessons from the past, we will repeat them.
Yeah, I just saw this morning a result of a survey where they asked people the question, what do you think of capitalism? What do you think of socialism? And among millennials, it was 50% who were, who supported capitalism, 49% supported socialism. So the same people asked the question, what do you think about free enterprise? 90% supported free enterprise. So, I mean,
yeah,
they don't understand what capitalism and socialism mean.
No.
No.
We're dealing with an ignorance based upon an education system which is now not actually teaching anything worth learning. That's the trouble. We're just raising generations of people now who know nothing about the most important things it is to know about. Right. Theology, philosophy, history, the humanities. They know nothing.
Well, now, yeah, that is a segue for me into this. It's not strictly true they know nothing. That's a little bit of hyperbole. But Cardinal Sarah uses hyperbole too. And we should be careful. I think what he says, just like what you said, is generally true, but it's not absolutely true. And so we have to be open to recognizing that a lot of good takes place. Some things are learned and so on. Nevertheless, you can still say they know nothing. And I think that's a lot truer than to say they know what they should know or they know something. Also, it's not all people's fault or our fault even. The problem with history is that someone said there's too damn much of it, right? I mean, it's cumulative with all the people on the planet doing things, and more things happen, more events, more dates, more treaties, more wars. You can't keep up with it all. No one can keep up with it all. But that's why Chesterton was so brilliant when he wrote an outline of history, An Everlasting Man. That's what really is the great service to mankind, is when historians, people who know more culture, art history, whatever, they're able to select, and present a picture of things which is accurate, even though it is abstracted or simplified.
Well, this is the important thing. When you talk about the outline, yeah, of course, there's an awful lot of history, far more than any of us can know. In fact, none of us can know it because except for God himself. But what we do need is the correct panoramic overview. It's like an atlas, right? If you need to know where everything is in relation to everything else in the world, and you obviously have to do that in the pages of a single book or even a double set spread. Same thing with history. Getting the outline right and in true perspective is important. And part of the problem is that most people have bought into the Marxist perspective of history, seeing this panorama in terms of the West being the enemy, of all being about economics and determinism, and not about free will, and certainly not about anything spiritual, atheistic. And so this sort of Marxist outline of history, this picture of the panorama. In other words, the problem is we have a false map. And if you have a false map, you get lost. And that's the problem we have now.
I would, rather than using Marxist, and it certainly is the Marxist view, I think I would rather use the term, though, materialist. Because, Henry Ford, the inventor of the automobile, famously said, history is bunk. And a lot of the technocrats out of Silicon Valley and so on, they think that the only things children need to learn are math and science. This whole focus on STEM for curricula for schools. And so what we have here is a kind of if you have a materialistic view, then you really don't have the ability to make the kinds of judgments in order to interpret history. You know, any history is really a work of interpretation. You're picking out what's important. And if you only have a quantitative material view of things, you can't really judge, well, what's really important and what's important to pass on. So this is kind of where we're stuck. And I might add, though, I'm bringing in China every opportunity I can, because, of course, the Cultural Revolution in China was a deliberate attempt to violently obliterate that people's history and culture, destroying even the graveyards with the tombstones, changing the Chinese alphabet with this new simplified, which just obliterated all this Chinese literature. And it was deliberate. In our world, this is not done through a kind of coercive force. It's done in this insidious siren song of wealth and glory and prosperity through science and technology. So who needs the humanities anymore, or history or literature, these things? And again, the church is going to be the place that safeguards this treasury for future generations, just like the monks of old, right, scribbling those manuscripts.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. Obviously, ultimately, the problem is materialism, and the materialism comes in various different shapes and forms. But I would just reiterate that the ethnomasochism, the self-hatred, the hatred of the good things in the past, is something which is rooted in a Marxist understanding of history. And indeed, the Chinese obliteration of the Chinese past is an example of that.
Yes.
That there is only one correct way of seeing things, and that's the Marxist way of seeing things. And therefore, you do everything necessary to obliterate all error. In other words, everything in the past before Marx came along.
Right. That's right. And I wasn't really presenting an argument against that, simply saying that in our country we have in the way the same outcome in terms of what we're giving our children and our future generations, and yet we're going about it not out of the same. Ultimately, at the root, it's the same thing.
Well, here's a parallel. I mean, one of the characteristics of the Marxist society is surveillance of your citizens, and in having informers, people in your household, people in your block. Everybody's informing everybody else.
That's right.
You know, it was forced by the police state. We don't have that. We have Siri and Alexa and Exo. We put them in our homes, and they're listening to us.
Smart TVs and smart.
Yeah. I mean, everything you say when you've got your phone on.
Yep.
Is being recorded somewhere by someone. It's frightening.
We've done this voluntarily.
You know, this chapter 7, is called "Where is the World Headed?" It has to do with the idea of progress, where we're going. We just talked about the fact that, you know, if you relate the past, then you can invent anything you want as your fantasy for the future. But we're not going to get any farther this chapter today, so let us cut this off today and come back next week as we continue with this chapter on "Where is the World Headed?" How does that sound? Okay?
Sounds great.
All right. God bless you all. Thank you.